As you just heard, this meeting is being recorded, and thank you to Dr. Moats for permission to record this meeting. We've had a lot of requests from people who aren't able to make it because of a scheduling issue, and so we're making sure to record it. We can share this with our colleagues. And again, we'll get started in just a moment. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and jump in because Dr. Moats' time is incredibly valuable, and we are incredibly lucky to have her with us today, and so I don't want to lose even a minute. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sean Ross. I'm the Deputy Associate Superintendent of Academic Standards at the Arizona Department of Education. I've been in this role for a bit. Prior to that, I was the English Language Arts Director for the state and oversaw our K-3 reading legislation and our dyslexia legislation. And then prior to that, I was a classroom teacher and coach and site leader for 15 years. So this is my 21st year in education, though it all feels like it happened in the last year. That feels like 21 years on its own. So I think we should be able to double our time based on the pandemic. It really is wonderful to see all of you. For a little bit of context for today, because we do have some folks joining us for the first time. Recently, as part of a couple of large initiatives that we're really proud of, Arizona was awarded its first ever Comprehensive Literacy State Development Grant. Some of you may be familiar with it as the Striving Readers Grant. It's a $20 million federal grant targeted to help states, help schools improve and build sustainable, successful literacy systems steeped in the science of reading. And so we were awarded that grant, which we're really excited about. And then Arizona was actually selected by the Hunt Institute and Barksdale Institute to participate in the Path Forward in Teacher Preparation and Early Literacy multi-state initiative. We were one of 6 states selected. It was a highly competitive selection process, and Arizona was selected because of the innovations that are happening in this state, because of the incredible progress that has happened in early literacy in this state. And this was actually even before the very recent passing of Senate Bill 1572 and the advent of some funding for early literacy and early childhood that have happened relatively recently. And so as part of those initiatives, we realized, and we've understood for a bit, but this was a perfect timing, that we have real focus in our birth to 5 space for early literacy, in our K-12 space with particular focus on K-5, but in our K-12 space. And the spoke on the wheel that was missing, the piece of the triangle that was missing was higher education, and not missing in that great things weren't happening at higher ed and great things weren't happening on our end. We just weren't in enough communication, and that was actually failing on our part. We had not done enough to invite our higher education colleagues into the conversation and into the initiatives and into the work so that that literacy pipeline in Arizona goes from birth to adulthood the way it should, right? Because literacy starts at the beginning and it goes forever. And so we're really excited that as part of that initiative, we have established this Arizona Higher Education Literacy Committee. We've held one large meeting to sort of set the tone. And we knew in our second meeting, we wanted to have a guest speaker, and we could not believe our fortune when we were able to reach out to Dr. Moats, and she agreed to come speak to you today. I don't think I need to tell you how exciting this is for Arizona, for all of us to be in, to be able to learn from Dr. Moats today. I've been in this field for 21 years. There's not much that makes me nervous. I'm nervous today because I'm meeting somebody whose work I literally would read and then teach and then read and then teach. And so it's with real excitement that we have her here today. So I'm gonna do a quick introduction and then I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Moats for her presentation. Just a little heads up for what will happen today. Dr. Moats will present, and then we're actually gonna go into breakout rooms. You're gonna have some guided questions. You'll have about 10 minutes in breakout rooms to talk amongst each other and just record your thoughts. And then we will come back for a Q&A with Dr. Moats. So it is with unbelievable pleasure that I welcome her today. Dr. Moats has been a teacher, psychologist, researcher, graduate school faculty member, and author of many influential scientific journals. articles, books, and policy papers on the topics of reading, spelling, language, and teacher preparation. She earned a master's degree at Peabody College of Vanderbilt and a doctorate in reading and human development from the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She is best known for her research and writing about the need for improvement in teacher education. Her recent publications have focused on helping teachers understand the language basics for reading and writing. They include letters, professional development, language live, blended literacy intervention, and speech to print, language essentials for teachers, as well as a series of articles for the International Dyslexia Association. It is my unbelievable honor to welcome Dr. Louisa Moats to Arizona. Thank you, Dr. Moats.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. Is it okay if I share my screen now?
Please do.
Okay. And then we do this. And then we do this. Okay, well, it's my pleasure to join you today. I'm so excited about what's going on in Arizona, that you have mobilized all of the stakeholders, and including all of you in higher ed, to move things along in Arizona and address the chronic issues that really we are addressing across the country, not only through the Path Forward initiative of which you are a part, but also just because of this great wave of interest in so-called science of reading that we'll talk about this morning. My colleague Antonio Fierro is part of your group there, and that's very wonderful thing because he knows very well, more than anybody, that involvement of higher ed in the Mississippi Initiative, which was kind of the first one to really show significant results across the state from a statewide effort. Antonio was key in working with higher educators in Mississippi and really digging in and dealing with things like what's on the syllabus and how is the content taught and so on. And he deserves a lot of credit. And I have to say, for all of you, he's the real expert in our midst here today.
Wow. Well, thank you, Louisa.
Yeah.
But no way, no way.
Well, I have to say, I just have to say that. So, all right. So, in my time with all of you, I felt as if I should hit the high points of the conceptual base that we really want to get into the heads of our teacher candidates and talk about some of what we've learned about how to do that. And so we'll be talking about the content of reading instruction and how we teach it to teachers, and the practice elements of effective reading instruction and how best we get that to happen. So you all know that I did the paper on teaching reading is rocket science, and one of the striking things about that experience for me was that the American Federation of Teachers came to me after that paper had been around for 20 years and said, we need an update because not a lot has changed nationally. So we need to reinforce the message that we published in 1999. So that's why the paper is still there with some updates. So let's talk about these things. What is the science of reading? What are the main ideas about how children learn to read that we have to get right in our teacher preparation programs, and then from then on in everything else that we do to support better reading instruction in our schools? And then what does research tell us about the use of the science of reading as a basis for literacy instruction for racially, linguistically, and culturally diverse students? Because of course, nationally, there's more discussion about equity, diversity, inclusion than there has ever been in our society. And we need to pay attention and adapt what we do to make sure that these students are not once again left behind. So my frame of reference for talking about the science of reading is the research network that was established by the National Institutes of Health, and that was captured in this map that Reed Lyon put together. He was the director of the NICHD reading research program through the 1990s and into the early 2000s. And I'm so fortunate because I was drawn into this research network, not because of my own credentials as a researcher or my position as a clinician in Vermont at the time, but I was drawn in because Reed Lyon and I had worked together in Vermont for a decade after my doctorate was finished. And I also was known at that time for arguing on behalf of the knowledge base that teachers needed and the necessity for the research program that was being funded to somehow find translation in the work that we did with teachers, both in universities and then after teachers were licensed. So I ended up in 1997 being part of one of these NICHD projects headed by Barbara Foreman and Jack Fletcher, and it was funded through the University of Texas. And I was able, through that work, to build my relationships with the researchers who were carrying out these major studies. And I learned through that direct experience how research is done and what we mean by a scientifically conducted study and what we mean by reference to the science of reading. And for me, it's this huge body of work. It's thousands of studies that have been published in scientifically oriented journals. And what does that mean? There are standards for scientific work that are upheld by the journals. The scientific work is all peer reviewed. It is rigorously conducted. The people who get the grants in the first place have strong credentials as scientists, and they write grants that are vetted by a panel and that show that the researchers are addressing questions that are the next wave of questions building on the scientific base that exists around that question at the time. So these centers over the years have worked collaboratively with one another. They work collaboratively with other research enterprises in other parts of the world to examine how reading is learned across languages, across cultures, across societies with varying characteristics. So this is the image that I have when we talk around about the science of reading. And so therefore, when someone expresses ideas or opinions or preferences or writes a textbook or writes a program that claims to be supported by science, the first thing I do is look at the reference list to see whether or not these researchers who've gotten these grants and carried out research over decades are even cited in the reference list. So that's how I check myself whether a textbook is good, whether an article is good, whether it comes out of the same frame of reference, or whether it comes from a set of beliefs or a set of assertions that in fact have not been rigorously tested through scientific endeavor. So where are the references that one can go to that are well vetted, well reviewed compilations of reviews of all that work, syntheses of all that work? So I think of publications like this excellent textbook on the psychology of reading, headed by Keith Rayner, or Jack Fletcher et al.'s book on learning disabilities, which is not just about learning disabilities, It's about all that we know about the differences between good readers and poor readers. In order to understand poor readers, you have to have scientifically validated models of what it means to learn to read that explain good reading as well as poor reading. And also Mark Seidenberg's text, which is weighty but outstanding in terms of its explanation of what we know about scientific work to understand how reading is learned. And what is driving all this? Why has the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation and other entities and the Institute for Education Sciences, why have they spent hundreds of millions of dollars on research by all those institutions and more over the last 4 decades primarily? It's because reading failure persists in our society at such unacceptable rates. And of course, I was just talking with Sean about the situation in Arizona, which sounds like it mirrors the situation that we have documented today in a New York Times article about who has suffered most in the last year and a half because of COVID and who was suffering before that. Well, it's very clear that kids who are mostly minority kids who are in high poverty situations and less, under-resourced situations suffer with reading failure at much higher rates than more advantaged kids. It's totally unacceptable what has happened with these kids, and we have to do something about leveling the playing field for those kids. So the issue of dyslexia, which affects perhaps, you can argue about it, 5 to 15% of the population, is not the major issue here. The major issue is the proportion of kids in regular classrooms who are never diagnosed as dyslexic, who are failing to learn to read at unacceptable levels. We have to do something about that. We also know, and we need to let our teachers know, that reading failure begins very early in life. And this chart, which I got from the work of Roland Good, who did all the research around Dibble's originally and now Acadian's reading, shows all the studies on prediction of reading failure show over and over again that we can flag kids at risk even before they start formal reading instruction, certainly at kindergarten, but before then. So the main message of this chart and others like it, which come out of the study on prediction, is that kids don't outgrow these early indicators of risk. And as time goes on, the gap between the kids who start out on the right trajectory and the kids who are not showing readiness for learning to read at an average rate are destined to experience a wider and wider gap as time goes on, unless we do something very well-informed and intensive, especially when we get our hands on kids in kindergarten and first grade. And this is the best argument for saying that we need to fund intervention programs that begin at the pre-K level if we possibly can convince society to invest in that. Now, we also, because of all this research, have well-validated theoretical models on which we can hang our hats to make decisions about what to test for and what to teach and how to think about the kids who are, quote, behind or who are at risk for reading failure. And these models, and this one is 20 years old, I'm sure everyone on this Zoom call has seen it, Scarborough's Reading Rope, which is the product of her work as an outstanding top-level reading scientist. It is not something she drew on a whim because she had ideas that day. It is her way of showing 20 years ago what we knew from scientific work about the relationships among these causal contributors to language comprehension, and what we knew about the causal contributors to fluent word recognition, and how these strands interacted with one another over time. So at the time, you could ask a question like, how much does decoding skill contribute to overall reading comprehension? At what point in reading development? How much does background knowledge contribute? What's the relationship between background knowledge, vocabulary knowledge, and overall reading outcomes? So this is a very valuable model, but what it does not tell us is the relationship among these factors early in reading development. And a newer model that has the same elements depicted in a different way is the model proposed by Wes Hoover and Bill Tunmer in a very recent text. Unfortunately, it's quite expensive, so it's not finding its way to the educator community as readily. In our network, we have just sponsored a couple of seminars by Wes Hoover in which he talks about this model, which is based on the simple view of reading. And he was a student of Phil Goff's and has been working on teaching others about the simple view of reading now for a couple of decades. But what this shows is within word recognition and language comprehension, how the building blocks work. And this model shows graphically that if you don't know the alphabetic principle, you don't have phoneme awareness developed or adequate letter knowledge and rapidity and accuracy in letter knowledge, you don't have the basis for understanding the alphabetic principle or alphabetic coding skill, and so on. And that word recognition depends on these building blocks, plus other things that Mark Seidenberg talks about in his book. And on the language comprehension side of things, these building blocks are very fundamental, and background knowledge and inferencing is an influence with the integration of these building blocks and what he calls linguistic knowledge, or the ability to process language structures during the processing of language form meaning. And these are the main contributors to reading comprehension. And he uses this as a way of saying, now it's clear what we need to be testing for. So back to teacher education, we need to be building these models as points of reference for everything else that we talk about in a textbook or in a course. And so there are a lot of misconceptions that come out of people writing their opinions about reading and their beliefs about reading, their philosophies, that are just not anchored in these theoretical models that come out of science. And the main culprits to me are the implied belief that reading is a generic visual spatial skill, that somehow reading is primarily visual. But we know from science that generic visual spatial skills are virtually unrelated to reading and spelling, which is counterintuitive and needs to be explained to teachers from the outset. The error patterns that students make are linguistic and not visual, and often indicate weaknesses in skills that are dependent on phonology, especially. Language proficiencies are the best predictors of good and poor reading and spelling, and therefore, teachers need to understand language and what it means to be proficient in language and what language is made up of in order to understand something like word recognition depends on language. It doesn't depend on things like the shape of words and the context in which words are used. And they need to understand that rote visual memorization drills are generally ineffective. They're ineffective because they do not capitalize on what we have learned from science about the nature of learning to read and spell. And I like to use case studies, and we should all be using case studies to make this obvious. I mean, it's obvious. We all know great artists and mechanics and map makers who are terribly dyslexic, who are very poor at reading and spelling words, right? And I had this case when I was a clinician in Vermont of this 7th grader, very bright kid who was referred for poor reading and spelling, which you can see in the writing here. He hasn't learned how to spell your. He hasn't learned about the last sound on the word trip. He doesn't put an N in inviting because he's not processing that at a phonological level. These are very basic things that kids should be building skill with in the very early grades. But boy, can he draw. And he never had a teacher in drawing. This was a small rural school without any art, but he could draw. And he drew 3-dimensional figures with dynamic movement and so on. Fabulous visual spatial reasoning. It had nothing to do with his learning to spell the word ride or the word around, right? These are different. They're subsumed by different parts of the brain. So I think it's also very important to educate our teachers about what the brain has to do in order to learn to read and spell, and the highly specialized areas of the brain that underpin the learning of these language-based skills that require us to build special pathways in the brain. Teachers appreciate that information, and we can illustrate it with brain pictures and so on. So language is the heart of the matter. And we have gone too long expecting teachers to get what reading and spelling and writing are all about without teaching them enough about the structure of language and the acquisition of language in general, because written language is mapped onto spoken language, and we need the same vocabulary when we're talking about teaching written language as we use for instructing about oral language. Oh, here's my brain picture. This is one of the brain pictures we use when we teach teachers through letters. We do use these brain pictures. We do show brain pictures which are readily available from the University of Texas and other sources, and the work of Stanislas Dehaene, a 20-minute online lecture that he did on the reading brain that's highly instructive in getting this idea that in teaching we are helping kids build pathways that are not there in the brain when we're born. They're acquired through experience and instruction. So the model for word recognition generated by Seidenberg that we have usurped, I would say, is useful for pointing out that when we teach word recognition, we have to teach phonics in order to build word recognition skill, and we have to educate these different systems of the brain in order to help kids accomplish that. So in teaching, teachers want to be sure that we're very clear about what the phonological processing system is responsible for in the brain, what the orthographic processing system does, and how they get linked up. What's the match between speech and print, and why is it advantageous to link meanings of words to these jobs that the phonological system and the orthographic system have to perform in our brains, and why we want eventually to think about this tripartite system in teaching word level skills and then embedding word level skills in a meaningful context. So it's very important to get across to teachers that when we recognize a word in print, when I flash this up, your brains cannot prevent the recognition of this word. It's instantaneous. And why is that so? It is not so because you've memorized a string of letters. It is so because those letters have been coded as representations of linguistic units that exist at several different levels. At the morphological level, where we process the prefix, base word, and suffix of that word. At the syllabic level, where we process each individual syllable and recognize that, and our brains know that there are 4 syllables in that spoken word, and we recognize the graphemes that represent the phonemes of the word. So graphemic representation is a direct representation of all of the speech sounds in a word. That's what we mean by a grapheme. So the fact that EA represents E, and the CH represents ch, and the LE represents this syllabic O on the end of the word. Those are graphemic representations. And when we think about this as a pyramid of learning, of course, it is learned in reverse. It is learned. First, the kids learn the letters, then they build on that letter knowledge, hopefully through good phonics instruction, how the graphemes represent the phonemes, and phoneme awareness has to be taught so that these graphemes are connected to speech sounds, and then we build from there to accomplish automatic word recognition. It's very important that teachers understand the developmental process of building this pyramid and the levels and layers of language that are associated with that. So I just flashed up some letters. I should have warned you I was going to flash up those letters because I wanted you to see just a string of letters and what it would be like if you saw that string of letters for a second and then I took it away. Well, what would you hang on to in order to remember that? But now I'll flash up the string of letters again. And what would you hang on to remember that? Well, you all do already know how to read. So you probably said to yourself, oh, there was something pronounceable in there. That will help me remember that. But if I flash it up as a known string of letters, it's instantaneous that you process that word as beneficial. I cannot prevent you. If you know that word, I cannot prevent your brain from recognizing that, because when you see print, you attach that pronunciation to that word because, again, you have built up that layer cake of knowledge of these of these linguistic units. Let's use that term. You have built up knowledge of the phoneme grapheme correspondences, the syllable structure, the fact that that AL on the end of the word makes it into an adjective, and that word has a grammatical function as a describer, and it has common morphemes that we know if we have a vocabulary beyond a 4th grade level in which that prefix bene is used and the suffix al is used and the root fic, which is related to this root, to make in Latin. So this is the Latin layer of language. It's what intermediate and more advanced students eventually need to acquire. And when we're really literate and we have a vocabulary, seeing this word beneficial activates in our brains all these other words that are related morphologically and etymologically to the word that we're reading. It's fascinating to see these laboratory experiments where a word like this is flashed up to a good reader, and the activation patterns spread through the whole mental dictionary. And we know that through priming experiments, for example, that once a person has read this, if then they're given this word, that they'll read it faster because it's already been primed in the brain. Those activation patterns, once they're triggered, if you put up the next word, well, it's recognized even faster because these networks are already there in the brain that associate these related words. It's like building a complex tree with lots and lots of related branches. Okay, but the big but is all of this is largely unconscious. And until we teach teachers what's going on, well, they're not going to appreciate the mind of the learner. We have to make it explicit. We have to open the window into this little black box because processing is automatic for a good reader. So insight doesn't help you see that language layer cake. The automaticity of good readers is an impediment to insight. The print-to-speech associations are processed too rapidly. Most of us don't remember when we learned those. And all of this has led to real misconceptions about reading, about skilled reading and how it takes place. What we want to get across is awareness that the ability to make these associations to linguistic units is the result of a developmental process where experts are very different from novices, very different from novices. One of the things that we do with teachers extensively is phoneme grapheme mapping. When we're at that base layer of learning how to read, we want to make sure that teachers in training are very clear about how the speech sounds of English are represented in the grapheme system, that they know very well the difference between a consonant blend and a consonant digraph. They know very well about vowel teams and about long vowel patterns. They can explain these. They can tell you why what that E is doing on the end of drive, that it not only marks the vowel as long, it also keeps the word from ending in a plain V and things like that, that no word in English ends in V. What we want to be sure they understand is that the shape of a word has nothing to do with how it is learned and how it is processed. It is not distinctive in any way. I can write this word in capital letters and it will still mean that we decode that word by the phoneme grapheme correspondences sh, a, p, and I blend it together, shape. And when I've done that a number of times, that word image becomes automatized or consolidated in my lexical memory, and I will be able to read it without sounding it out when I am proficient. But I am proficient, I am not like a novice, and the novice needs to sound it out to get there. So what we want to disabuse our teachers of is that relying on context for word recognition is a very poor practice, and it is what poor readers try to do because the phoneme grapheme correspondence process and the linguistic analysis process is laborious for them and hard. And they try to rely on context. They try to look at the pictures to guess at the words. They try to make a good guess on the basis of the first letter. But you know what? We've been showing in scientific studies for decades that that does not work. It is not how a proficient reader learns to read, and it is not what goes on in the mind of a skilled reader. So our larger goal is going to be to associate and connect the form of a word as kids have to learn it, as I just illustrated with the word unreachable or the word beneficial. They have to connect the form of the written word, which is captured in our orthography, with the meaning of the word. And we have to use, again, our scientific knowledge to understand that the most proficient readers with the largest vocabularies have elaborated their mental dictionaries with words that are known at a deep level. So this is all coming from the work of Charles Perfetti and his emphasis on deep lexical quality in memory. It's a goal for instruction. So what do we want when we're teaching vocabulary? Instead of thinking of it as a totally different enterprise from teaching kids how to read the words, is we then connect how the words look in spelling and in speech with networks of meaning. So the multiple meanings of the words, how they're used in context, how they're related in antonym relationships, synonym relationships, and examples in context. But I'm using the term context here not as a primary strategy for word recognition, but rather a primary strategy for knowing how a word is used in a sentence and in a paragraph in the context, the semantic context in which it is used. That's very different from appealing to context in order to recognize the word in the first place, which is a mistake. And these concepts have to be elaborated for teachers so they really understand. And then when it comes to teaching about reading comprehension, of course, the great debate, I would say, about comprehension that's ongoing right now is how much it is valuable to teach strategies as an avenue for bolstering reading comprehension. And there has been a lot of emphasis, as you know, on the importance of background knowledge in driving comprehension. And here's where I stand with it. I think that the knowledge matters movement has underplayed and underestimated the importance of knowledge of language structure and the ability for students to navigate when they're reading text, to navigate the complex syntax of the text and to navigate the organization of the text as far as where you expect to see main ideas and details and how you approach it if a sentence is never ending and tangled up, and how you find the subject of a sentence and how you extract, how you interpret figurative language and those sorts of things that you find in literary text and in informational text. So if we can balance this emphasis on the importance of background knowledge in driving what students will get out of a text, and it is very important, with also an awareness that we need to help students interpret what we call the text base, that is, the meanings in the sentences and the meanings in the individual words as they're being used in a text, by helping students practice grasping longer syntax and writing longer syntax. So getting a grip on syntax, getting a grip on academic vocabulary through the study of morphology, for example, and figurative language, then invoking some strategies for building a mental model is also helpful. So we need all of this. We need awareness of building background knowledge and the importance of that in driving comprehension. Yes, it is true that students who know more about the subject matter they're reading about will get more out of the text, will use more advanced strategies, and will be able to navigate the text language better. But we can help poor readers do that as well with a step-by-step approach to all of that. It is all good and all helpful. So these are some of the things we target when we give practice to teachers as they're preparing to teach a complex text to students. Using context to decipher word meanings, interpreting figurative language. How do you give practice in interpreting idioms, for example? Detecting multiple meanings and dealing with anticipating those in text reading. Anticipating academic language formalities, especially things like verb tense, imperfect verb tense, and things like that. Discourse structure, what do you anticipate depending on the genre? Phrase structure in sentences and parsing phrases. Topic-specific terminology. All of these things have to be anticipated by teachers who are getting ready to teach a text to students. So I'm saying it should be very text-specific, because not every text is going to have figurative language in it, for example. So it's good instruction in text comprehension is somewhat opportunistic. There is not a formula for doing it. And the best thing, I think, for helping teachers get ready to do this is to take a lot of examples of texts that they will have to teach and walking them through the exercise of planning how to teach it, planning the questions they're going to ask, planning what the summary exercises are going to be, working with each other on that, and if possible, going out and trying it out and then comparing notes on how it went, if they're able to do that as student teachers. Now, okay, back to the data here. I wouldn't be talking to you about all of this, and especially about the equity gap for students at risk, if we hadn't already shown over and over again that it's possible to reduce the rate of reading failure by the end of first grade down to between 4% and 6% of the population in the school. And there are multiple sources for this data. I can send you the references, but this was, a couple of decades ago, and it was the impetus for Reading First, that if we did all the things we know about from science, and we intervene with kids early, most of these were first grade studies, the number of kids, a proportion of kids coming out of first grade with the signs of incipient reading failure would be greatly reduced. And most of these studies had significant proportions of students students who were African American, students who were Hispanic, students were from low-income families, however you characterize students at risk. So I think there is more research now, especially targeted at the issue of the language differences that kids bring into this early learning experience. What should we be doing about dialect speakers? What should we be doing about English learners? We have very good research and studies we can hang our hats on, published in reputable journals that give us some guidance. And our group has been interested in learning from those who are doing the work on bridging the language differences between African American kids who are dialect speakers coming into kindergarten and first grade, and understanding both how dialect can slow the process of learning to read and spell English as it is written in mainstream English texts, but the extra work that these kids have to do to translate basically and understand the differences in these language systems. but we're learning from the researchers that there are tools, there are materials, there are strategies for constructive and respectful instruction that help kids make that bridge, that transition, and that can be done without being pejorative, critical, demeaning, and some of the, very unfortunate ways of dealing with dialect that have been harmful in the past. So comparative analysis of language systems is probably the best way to characterize also instruction for English learners, emerging English learners, and whenever possible, it is great to make explicit, overt comparisons between the language systems that the kids come to school with and the language that they're having to use as readers and writers and speakers of mainstream English, or whatever we're calling it now. The terminology keeps changing, so it's hard to keep up with that. We know that through all of this, the process of instruction, especially for kids at risk, that is most effective is systematic, explicit. That means the teacher is there leading the instruction. It is not discovery learning on the whole. It is not student directed on the whole. It is systematic, explicit, cumulative, multimodal, and for kids who need it, intensive, and the focus is on the structure of language. My name has been associated with a number of papers over the last 25 years, pointing out the obvious, that if these things are true about students learning to read and write, then of course our teachers have to be given a really solid foundation in all of these concepts, and especially the structure of language and the acquisition of language, both for reading and writing. And I and many other colleagues have documented over and over again that most teachers, the majority, have not had adequate background when they're set loose in classrooms. And most of the surveys that we have done have been not only with teachers in training, but also experienced licensed teachers who have not been given the information they need. And it is time for us to change this. So one effort that I've been associated with is the generation of the knowledge and practice standards for teachers of reading, published by the International Dyslexia Association. But notice the title of these standards is for teachers of reading, all teachers of reading, because what goes on in the regular classroom should be aligned with what goes on in the intervention. And the intervention programs should be just more intensive and the same content, but taught in more detail, more step-by-step way, with more repetition, more practice, more feedback, more scaffolding, so that, and lots more practice, so that those students can accelerate their rate of learning and participate in regular classroom instruction. But what we don't want to have happen is that the general ed teachers are off with a totally different view and different philosophy and different instructional materials that have nothing to do with what goes on in the intervention. That's sort of self-sabotaging. This is a cartoon. I always love to remind us of, we have lots of information technology, meaning we have now some resources, we have computer programs, we have this and that to hang our hats on. But if we don't access the information that's really going to help us reduce reading failure, we're not going to be ahead of the game. I'm pleased to report that the NCTQ sees that there is improvement, at least in our teacher training institutions, when it comes to addressing the so-called 5 pillars of reading, the 5 essential components. But still, if we have, you know, all those other teacher prep programs not even addressing some of these major essential components of instruction, where are we going to be? And we do have data showing that when we give teachers the requisite information and help them learn what I'm talking about, that there is a significant effect on student learning and student outcomes. Of course, that's where the rubber meets the road. So to sum up here, what do we need to be teaching our teachers? Number 1, scientifically sound models of how we learn to read and get the fluff out of the textbooks and the workshops. Secondly, comprehensive roadmaps for teaching all these essential components independent of the programs, because the programs of instruction keep changing, and the publishers only publish what the consuming public wants. So if the consuming public wants better materials and programs that integrate what I'm talking about, they will change. How English language is structured at all levels. I'm a strong believer in several courses that help teachers learn what they were never taught, and then modeling and practice of the lessons and how they're carried out. So I thank you all. We'll go to the discussion now. I love this quote from Anna Quinlan's wonderful little book, How Reading Changed My Life. I recommend it. Books are the means to immortality, yes, but only if you can learn to read. So we have to make sure that all of our students have access to the means for immortality. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moats. That was, my neck hurts from nodding. It was informative and just a great reminder, and actually contains some newer resources as well that I know there was some discussion about in the chats, and some titles of books that many of us were discussing. And so that was excellent, and thank you so much. We are going to actually put you all into breakout rooms for about 10 to 15 minutes now, so that you have a chance to talk and marinate and discuss. And we have some guided questions in the breakout room. So what the instructions will be is as you're assigned to a room, please just pay attention to the number that you're assigned to, because, and I'm putting the link in the chat here, there is a link to the chat, so if everybody could click on it, just make sure it's working for you, to some Google Slides. You will be assigned to a breakout room. And actually, I'm going to share my screen very quickly and show you the slides. So let's see. Can you guys, Aisha, can you see my slides? Just, yep, good, thank you. And big shout out to Aisha Johnson, who is here helping us with tech today. She is amazing. And so it looks like you're all able to get in. Once Aisha assigns you to a breakout room, just pay quick attention to the number. You'll go to the slide that matches the number of your breakout room. Very quickly, somebody please just volunteer to be a recorder. It's always the same person who lets people into traffic too. You're a good person, so volunteer to be a recorder. And then pick one of the 3 questions to begin with. Start discussing. If somebody, the recorder, can take notes, and then have a nice discussion. If it goes some other places, that's great too. We just want to gather your thoughts. 1, that'll help us provide feedback to Dr. Moats, and then 2, that'll help us shape some of the Q&A after the sessions, and then most importantly, it'll help us shape future meetings of this committee, and to know where we might want to target some future meetings. And so we're going to put you in those breakout rooms again. The instructions are to pick a recorder, pick a question to begin with, take notes right on the slide that corresponds to your breakout room, and then we'll be back in about 15 minutes to have a little Q&A with Dr. Moats. So Aisha, do you want to start the breakout rooms? Welcome back, everybody. I know that felt like a quick time. Breakout sessions always do, and I know we were having a rich discussion in our session. In particular, we chose to focus on the question about challenges to infusing programs with the science of reading. We had a very rich discussion. I hope that you had some rich discussions as well. We're actually, again, going to use the notes on these slides to help inform future meetings. We wanted to make sure to leave a little bit of time at the end for a Q&A with Dr. Moats. We also have Dr. Fierro here, who is amazing as well. We have a lot of support here for any questions that we may have. And so please raise your hand if you know how to do that. If you look down at the bottom of the screen, there's a reactions button, and you can click the raise hand button. So if you raise your hand, if you have questions, we'll happily have you unmute. I'll call on you, and then if you can unmute. Dr. Graham, do you want to go first? Oh, Aisha, do they have the ability to unmute? Can you, sorry, Aisha, can you give everybody the ability to unmute? Sorry, Dr. Graham. There we go.
There it is. Sorry, it's not working. I have to go back and do it.
Hi, Louisa. How are you doing?
Hi.
You probably could anticipate the question I'm going to ask you. I have wondered over the last 20 or 25 years, we've acquired a considerable amount of evidence that writing, either writing about what you're reading, connecting reading and writing at kind of the word level, as you talked about, connecting at the discourse level. I mean, I could go on of this, but it has a positive effect on reading and vice versa, that there's reciprocal effects. And I would argue that the science of reading has sidestepped this or stepped over it. I'm not sure which is the more accurate on this, but I think there may be some things that would be useful for updating the science of reading to bring in other tools that have also been shown to facilitate reading and reading growth, but also work back in the other direction as well. So I'm just curious as you're thinking about that.
Well, I really agree. And you know about my interest in spelling, of course. I always say it's the poor relation in language arts. And in these textbooks that student teachers are given, there's nothing about, you know, other than some very old-fashioned things about give a list on Monday and test it on Friday and stuff like that. But Steve, I agree. And so, you know, I think this is what's happened. Just getting the reading part right has been such a struggle. And to get these really poorly conceived practices to, you know, out of mainstream instruction, it's been such a struggle. It's like, oh, how can we get people to pay attention to writing too? It's like, okay, maybe once we get an accepted set of ideas about reading, that people will be more ready to embrace the role of writing. And Steve, without all the work that you've done for 30 years, thank heavens, multiple reviews and papers, and I love the last one I gave to all the letters trainers to read, and we had fun with that. It was a great synthesis of all the research you've done, but there has to be more. I mean, one of the things I said when we were reading your paper is, does anybody else do this research? It's like, because you've been such a flag bearer for that issue. And it's great that you're part of this discussion. So yes, yes, yes. I mean, what you're saying is right. And let's push for that broader consideration.
Thank you, Dr. Graham. Other questions? Looking for hands up. Hope I'm not missing any. I know if you don't mind me volunteering one, I know, oh, actually, I'm sorry. I'm gonna hold off on that. Terry Clark, no, go ahead, Terry.
Sean, you could have asked a question. Dr. Moats, again, thank you. And thank you, everyone. And Dr. Graham knows that we're such a huge fan of his work and really try to approach here in Arizona writing as being part of literacy. But one of the things that we hear a lot that I wanted to sort of get your guidance on is how to address, you know, the decades of research that sort of do point to, you know, the evidence of strategies that work, and then sort of the newer research that's coming or might be coming or points to some, you know, added layers to it. Sort of how do you, in the science of reading kind of debate, kind of how do you navigate through kind of new research that might be pointing some things to consider, doesn't negate, you know, decades of research that's also pointed to what works, but would love your thoughts on that.
Well, I think the wonderful paper that the Florida Center for Reading Research just published in Reading Research Quarterly, Yakov Petcher is the lead author, but all the major researchers who are affiliated there contributed. It's a wonderful kind of explication of this idea that there are certain findings that have been replicated so often and explored in so many ways that we can say, definitely we know these things, and to err from these basic understandings and the practices that emanate from them is really a mistake. And then science, as they say, you know, well, one of the things we need to teach teachers about is, well, how does science work anyway? And science works, and Steve's latest paper that we wrote talks about this as well. Science works by continuing to generate questions on the basis of what has just been explored or established or found. So science is always, you know, hopefully pushing the envelope. It's on the edge of questions. Questioning is the basic driver of scientific endeavor. And scientific endeavor, you know, that when we talk about the science of reading, one of the things that concerns me is that to use that term, it sort of conveys that it's all settled now. And so there's this body of knowledge, and there we go, and there's not much that's going to change or be debated. But that's not so. We have areas that are really solid, and then we have areas for which we have very promising evidence, but it's not really pinned down yet. And then we have other areas where we think we have consensus, perhaps among practitioners, about good practices, but they haven't been explored sufficiently in rigorous research. So everybody needs to understand that. And maybe one way to get that across to teachers is just to have them be party to a real scientific discussion somewhere along the way by people who are responsible for either carrying out a grant or generating a grant that proposes the next questions or something like that, so they get some idea about how all this works and that it's constantly progressing in the background. And the other thing they need to know, we deal with this a lot. The internet is often the enemy. You know, the stuff that gets thrown around in these Facebook discussions, it's really disheartening. But what happens is if one outstanding researcher questions another in a public forum, then everybody just goes crazy about thinking, well, so-and-so disagreed with so-and-so, and whose side are you going to take? And then it becomes a kind of discussion about things other than the issue at hand, which is unfortunate. But what everyone needs to know is this is the heart of scientific endeavor. Boy, you sit in a room with people on a team who are trying to work out how something should be researched, or what the question should be, or what methodology should be used, or what the data mean. Those discussions can be heated, but that's good. That's the way or look at the peer review of papers. I've served on review boards. I'm not doing that anymore now, but boy, this is not a friendly, sometimes not very friendly exchange that goes on, but this is the nature of the work. And it's okay when outstanding scientists disagree with one another, but the forum for doing that is through studies and debates about what the studies are showing and discussions about a research agenda that needs to be funded and things like that. It's not slinging your opinion on a Facebook page and accumulating followers. It's just very distressing.
Thank you. That was really helpful. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Terry. Dr. Moats, if we could, one last question and then we'll wrap up. I know sometimes we receive feedback that there's an idea that the body of the science of reading of that research is mutually exclusive to culturally relevant teaching or pedagogy. And how would you address that idea that they're separate entities?
Well, I see no conflict whatsoever. But I feel as if, okay, the most important job we have is to ensure that kids learn how to read no matter what their background. And it is better if we can do that while we respect the cultures represented in the classroom, while we can respect linguistic differences, while we can consider the importance of having readings, at least some readings in which students can, quote, see themselves. Those things are good. But as I look at the data on what matters as we are responsible for ensuring that kids learn to read, the first most important thing is that we teach them the content in a way that is most likely to work. And I'd love to include, and we also teach them to write, and we teach them to write standard English, or mainstream English, or whatever we're going to call it, in a way that will give students access to choices in life. And unfortunately, society is structured that way. There is a power structure in our society. There is a dominant language form that is upheld by editors and by, social expectations. It is advantageous for students to know that and be able to navigate within it. It is, and we can't change that very readily, but we can, be respectful. We can be embracing. We can work on diversifying our teacher corps. We can do all of these things that are part of the discussion about cultural responsiveness. But I don't see in any way that cultural responsiveness negates or replaces any of this basic information about how kids learn to read. The science on how people learn to read is totally blind to color, to socioeconomic status, to any of these other variables by which we classify our student bodies. But what the brain has to do to learn to read is the same. And if I could just punctuate this by saying that I spent 5 years as a white, privileged, educated investigator working in 9 low-performing, almost all African-American schools in Washington, D.C., where I was the distinct minority. These were, I had to learn about cultural relevance as an outsider and a minority, distinct minority in that setting. And what I learned from that, and what the data from this, all these studies that we published on the basis of this, is that the kids could learn to read. They had not been taught how to read prior to our getting there and providing everything I was talking about today, providing professional development, providing instructional materials aligned with what we were teaching, providing coaching support so that teachers could implement in a concentrated way, providing extra support, providing assessment that allowed us to see who was at risk. And at the end of this huge implementation experiment, lo and behold, the kids were at the national average and on their way. And we had, changed that trajectory. We had changed that so that these kids were on their way. And we did all of the things that I'm talking about. And it had, almost all the teachers were minority teachers. What we did not have at the time was what would now pass for culturally sensitive reading material. In 1997, that was pretty scarce. We tried to supplement by bringing in extra reading material for the kids where the subject matter and the illustrations were, more transparently reflective of the students we had. But that was a secondary consideration that was not primarily responsible for the positive outcomes we achieved. So, I don't see these things as being in conflict at all. I see them as, they could be happily married, if we could put it that way. And, let's aspire to do that.
I love the idea of being happily married. I've been happily married for 24 years. I don't know if my wife has been, but I have been. So I love that term. I'm going to totally steal that. Well, thank you so much again for joining us. I want to thank everybody who was a part of putting this together. Terry Clark from Read On Arizona, Ann Clark from the Path Forward Project, Antonio from the Path Forward Project. I want to thank many of you who joined us today, Representative Pollock, who has been a huge advocate in Arizona for early literacy, members of our state board, Ketcher and Alicia, who have also been advocates for early literacy, members of our department. But Dr. Moats, you most especially, thank you so much for joining us, for bringing your knowledge, your expertise, and your passion. Thank you for decades of work on which many of us have based our careers, and thank you for continuing to fight the good fight for early literacy. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.